So there are millions of those men at the bottom of the ladder in this world, and their suffering is invisible to everybody. And it's just criminal. Men's pain is just not seen. My hope is that men and women can take a path forward where we, both of us collectively, own our own shit, own our shadow aspects, and actually celebrate what the opposite sex brings to our lives, so that we bring out the best in each other.
Michael Ronin is an interdisciplinary cultural commentator, pulling together the threads of an unraveling world to provide clarity amidst all the crazy. He is the author of a new book, Modern Masculinity for the Conscious Man, Making Sense in Troubled Times, which details the obstacles and opportunities facing the conscious man and the world in which he operates. Michael, it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Warren, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
Yes. I'm sure we're going to have a great conversation tonight about your book and about many issues. So I read the book, I finished it recently, and I found it to be a fascinating read. My general impression was that you've done a lot of reading and a lot of independent thinking and research on a variety of issues, but all of them centered around the core topic of what it means to be a man in the modern world, and the challenges and opportunities that we face, and how those have changed from previous eras. So I was very impressed by it, and I think the book itself is a great conversation starter for people that are interested in masculinity or men's issues or the manosphere or any of that. So I want to start off by asking you, because it's in the title, how do you define a conscious man?
Yeah, so I guess I should maybe start off by saying what an unconscious man is. So from the time we are born, as we enter this world, what we do is we hand over our minds to our caregivers, primarily our caregivers, our parents and teachers, because we have no choice. And they start programming us and instilling certain beliefs and values in us, which again, we have no choice about. So we are largely and unconsciously programmed by our environment from a child. And it's only when we hit maturity that we have the ability to reflect back on our existence and do some self-auditing to discover what aspects of ourselves serve us and which do not. So the unconscious basically do not make that deliberation. They are largely predisposed to certain prescriptive behaviors, and pretty much as long as they live, they favor a state of unconscious thought and unconscious action in the world. So being unconscious is essentially to lack free will. Which kind of brings me to what consciousness is. Obviously, then consciousness is it's about I would say it's about to be kind of romantic about it, it's the cultivation of the soul, and it's about a man's ability to self-author himself. So to be conscious is to be free. We're in charge of our own internal world. And how we interact with the external world. We are capable of having our own thoughts, rather than the thoughts that were implanted in us at an earlier age. So going back to what I was saying before, it means looking at what programming and illusions and distortions that we have inside us that are holding us hostage. That are not true, essentially that are not true, or maybe partially true, or partially false. So we want to investigate our belief systems and those limiting ideas about ourselves and about those aspects of us and about how we think. And the aim, essentially, is to like in the movie, it's to unplug ourselves from the matrix. It's to unplug ourselves from our bad habits and our cognitive structures, and from our broader social and societal influences, the institutional frameworks of power and influence, that we are, it's a kind of a soup. We find ourselves in a soup of narratives out there. These frameworks of power and influence, again, want to program us. So we received it as a child unawarely, and then when we hit adulthood, we continue to receive false messaging around us. So that there is a process here of extricating ourselves from unhelpful and untrue thinking. And so, most, I would say that most spiritually minded people focus on their inward expansions of their consciousness. So I go into the book, and I recognize that in the book, and it's entirely pertinent to a conscious man's journey, but that's not where it ends. You don't simply look inside yourself. You have to look outside to the broader social influences around you. So it, to see and to realize how civilizations, in the plural, have shaped men and women and shaped us to enslave our minds, and from time to time in history, our bodies, and our productive capacities as well. How we apply ourselves to the world is very constrained, and not a lot of people realize how constrained that is. So I go into that quite a lot, about how we are still enslaved in this modern age, despite the fact that we consider ourselves to have put slavery behind us. So just to sum it all up, really the point is to question our own perspectives. And that means doing some uncomfortable work. It means coming face to face with either our inner resistances, or at the outer resistances. So Voltaire, for instance, once said, if you find out who you are not allowed to criticize, I'm butchering his quote, but essentially it was, if you're not allowed to criticize a certain person or a certain institution, then you are not free, and they are your rulers. And we need to be aware of that as conscious men. So by consciously intervening in the process of our own unfolding, we actually help the world, because if we remained unconscious, we would unawarely pass on to those people around us and to our children unhelpful judgments, which closes down more minds and more hearts. So the quest is for freedom, and breaking outside of these rigid, personal, subjective realities, and these kind of thought constraints which shackle the mind. So the book is really for that sort of man. It's for the conscious man who might consider himself a libertarian, let's say. Now, there are left libertarians and right libertarians, and I try not to pigeonhole myself as being one or the other, but to classify myself as a free thinker. And I take truth wherever I find it, whether it's on the left or the right or the up or the down, anywhere on the political spectrum, anywhere on the informational spectrum.
That's a very interesting description. And it made me think of several things. One is the way you describe conscious man reminded me of kind of, I guess it was the Socratic phrase of the examined life and the unexamined life.
Yes.
Where they said, in order to really start living on this world, you have to look at everything that you've come to believe and all of your habits and behaviors, and put it under a lens of analysis and say, is this really helpful? Is this healthy? Is this taking me towards my potential or away from it? Is that sort of one of your inspirations?
Definitely. And really, it's a book which has a very broad scope, as you've probably realized, having read right through it. There's stuff out there which is, how to optimize your career, how to get 10 steps to better abs, all that sort of thing for men, which is helpful for those sort of microcosms of the masculine experience. But this book is basically the macrocosm of the masculine experience. And I guess you could say that it's a map. The book is a map. I consider myself a map maker. So just to elaborate, a map is different from the terrain that it describes. It represents a simplified version of it. So obviously, if you walk out into the great outdoors and you have your terrain in front of you, and you're trying to make sense of it, you can either wing it by walking around and discovering what's in that terrain, stumbling, getting lost, making mistakes, or you can have a map which helps you navigate it. And this book is basically a map for, I would say, younger men between 25 and 35, but it's also very valuable for older men as well. Certainly also in terms of understanding younger men's obstacles and pressures in their lives. If a map is too simplistic, if this was going to be like a really short book, then there would be more likelihood of men making wrong turns. If you have a simple map, it's much easier to make wrong turns in your life. So it's a very comprehensive book. But just like with any map, if you follow it rigidly, you're still likely to make mistakes. So you have to use your own better judgment in determining what's appropriate for your actual circumstances. And my hope is basically to equip conscious men with the intellectual, emotional, and spiritual as well, all aspects of his beingness, all the tools that he needs to meet the demands of his journey through life, and to examine what those tools are, what he has available to himself to apply in the here and now. What are the inner resources, the inner tools, and what are the outer tools available to him? And so because it's so broad, you could actually, I could summarize it by saying, this is a book about epistemics. It's first person, second person, and third person epistemics. So first person epistemics is about know yourself. So it's about the journey of a man to understand himself and connect with his true nature and to be authentic in this world. Second person epistemics is about know the other. And in this case, I focus largely on the feminine. So this is a book about masculinity, but we have to set it in counterpoint to the feminine as well. So I talk a lot about how to understand women, how to understand femininity, and understand the paradigm in which women operate and why modern men have such social antagonism directed at them by women and the feminist establishment as well. Third person epistemics is about like know the world. So know yourself, know the other, know the world. And so I go into the political, economic, and social environment in which we find ourselves in this modern age.
That's an interesting way of describing it. It kind of reminds me of, have you read Ken Wilber's work at all?
I'm actually just reading it for the first. I mean, I've listened to him a few times. I have an audio book and I've seen him on video, but I've just started reading his main work.
Right.
Yes, the integral theory.
Yes, the integral perspective. That was kind of like at the center of his whole work. And not to take attention off your book, of course, but
oh no, let's talk about him. I love him.
Yeah, exactly. He's a great writer.
Yeah.
But it made me think about how he had sort of the inner individual, the inner collective, and the outer individual and the outer collective, framework of analysis. It's just a lens through which to look at the world.
Definitely.
And to look at oneself. And
yes.
This first, second, and third person epistemics that you describe, you're right. You do go into a great deal of detail in the book about the conscious man, the modern man. In order to understand what he's up against in life, he needs to look inside, but he also needs to look outside.
Yes.
At the outer world, and he needs to look at the opposite sex, women, and understand them.
Yes.
And then you're going to have a proper map from which to navigate.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there is quite a bit of detail in the book on how to do this navigation and how to tackle all the many challenges that the modern man is up against. I wondered if you thought that the concept of epigenetics might also be one of the threads through your book. To me, this is one thing I took out of it, was that we all, like men and women, both have biological realities. We have kind of a point of origin we're coming from.
Correct.
Which is largely unchanging throughout the course of our life. But then, of course, your biology and your psychology, it may have an origin and a root, but then it can change a little over time, but it can be expressed in different ways depending on the social, cultural, political, economic, and environmental context in which you live. And so certain good or bad traits, certain strengths and weaknesses can be expressed or not expressed depending on the conditions we find ourselves in.
Correct, yes. Yes, so men and women obviously operate from a particular perspective of their own masculine energetics or feminine energetics. And that determines how we walk through this world to quite a large degree. So in terms of men, I guess you could say that masculinity itself are those traits which have persisted for all time across all cultures. And we can identify, we've done a pretty good job of identifying what those masculine traits are. Now, clearly, we're also operating within a cultural paradigm as well, which influences and directs us to think about femininity and masculinity in certain ways, which might not be true. So, for instance, I would say that the traits that have persisted for all time in terms of the masculine essence will be those which are, for instance, being structured and rigorous and grounded and self-disciplined and having leadership qualities and being strategic, having the capacity for abstract thought, for focusing more on things than people, and many other traits as well. The current, certainly within the manosphere, the gold standard of masculinity is held up as the alpha male. And I have actually questioned if that's true or not within the book, because certainly in our modern, fast-paced, industrial, capitalistic world, the alpha male does very well. And yet, I would also suggest that the modern-day industrial capitalistic world does not serve the unfolding and the full expression of either men or women. So if we say that the alpha male is the gold standard, and that this has persisted over all cultures for all time, then I think we can actually poke some holes in that. I think there are certain truths about the alpha male that do represent fully functional, fully regulated masculinity, but there's also something which is, I would say is just a reaction to the environment in which we find ourselves. So at the beginning of your question, you were talking about epigenetics and how that ties in as well. So we have both feminine and masculine energies within us, but we are also masculine and feminine energies walking through this world and being affected by it. And that affects our nervous system. And so I've also touched upon that. Well, I've actually written a chapter about it in the book, about wounding and trauma and how it produces. I would say that there's no such thing as a toxic male or a toxic masculinity, but the qualities that are described as toxic or toxic masculine qualities are essentially wounding that a man has experienced in his life. And we can go into that later if you like. But my view is that today, the problems we face in the world, broadly speaking, very, very broadly speaking, have nothing to do with masculinity or femininity or the true nature of men and women, or any inherently flawed biological programming. Masculinity is not toxic. Femininity is not toxic, but we have maladaptive ways of meeting this world. And it has to do with the wounding and trauma, which is stored at the level of our nervous system. And so if you look around us and see how the world is dysfunctional and how polarized it is, and I would suggest that this has been generations in the making, and the world in which we find ourselves, generation to generation, from all the suffering that we've experienced historically, certainly for the last 12,000 years, has produced human beings who are regulated and programmed by pain and by fear. And all we're doing is trying to cope. But we meet the world in very dysfunctional ways. So the hypothesis that I've generated is actually an extension of the generational trauma hypothesis. So some of your listeners might be familiar with the studies which were undertaken on ex-prisoners of Nazi Germany from the Holocaust, the Jews that were held in concentration camps, and their offspring as well, and how epigenetics played a role in producing generational changes in behavior of those individuals. So, and I won't go into that in detail here, but what it's led me to consider is that the human nervous system is a key element in the respect of the development of civilization, to such an extent that we have been marching ever forwards towards increasingly dysregulated states of large-scale stress, large-scale flight, states of fight and flight and freeze normalcy. If you look around us, if you can actually see people who you present them with information, for instance, which challenges their worldview, and they react in a very limbic way. It's a population which is chronically traumatized, and so, but we don't recognize that as such. We're so normalized to trauma. We don't see the suffering, the mental, emotional, and physical dysfunction that's all around us, that has its roots in this generational trauma, that multi-generational trauma.
Yeah, and I just have a question on this point, which is that I agree that there is trauma we face regularly in life, but the traumas of the 21st century in Western countries are quite different than some other parts of the world are facing today, as well as our own history. If you go back prior to the Industrial Revolution, I think the greatest challenge most people were facing is just survival of how to find food, how to avoid being killed in war, or how to avoid communicable diseases. And now, for the most part, in developed countries, famine and disease is not, of course, we just came through a pandemic, so that's a little asterisk, but for the most part, those concerns are not the primary challenges. But
yes.
We face different forms of trauma and stress. So, and there's a typical masculine response to those stresses and traumas, and there's a typical feminine response. And then, of course, both have a range. They're not binary, but they're kind of, there's one circle over here, there's another circle over there, there's some overlap. How do you think the traumas have changed from the past to the present, and our responses to them as well?
Yeah. So again, this has been multi-generational, and unhealthy people have shaped civilizations and created civilizations which were dysfunctional, and those civilizations in turn have shaped people in unhealthy ways, and that is a classic vicious circle. So, in the past, there were certainly more wars. There were more men died in the battlefields. More men died on the factory floors. More men lost their lives just meeting a world which was less tamed than it is today. If you look around us, we no longer need to go out and hunt for game or go out and process and dress game. We can live in air-conditioned homes. We don't have to go to a foreign land to fight hand to hand. We can just send a drone to go and bomb the fuck out of them. And we can jump in an automobile where, before we either had to walk or get on a horse and ride somewhere. And, we jump in the automobile, put our favorite music on, turn on the air conditioning, and life is, we can distract ourselves with digital versions of sex. So, there's Pornhub, there's OnlyFans, there's VR sex, Tinder, all these sorts of things where we can distract ourselves. So yes, I mean, in terms of the harshness of this world, we've tamed this world to a great extent, but in doing so, we have disconnected ourselves from the natural world and from each other. And this is where our trauma derives from. We are alienated from the living systems, from understanding what it is to be a living organism, in fact. And there is a sense-making crisis as well, that we no longer have reference points in which to understand the world around us. And all of this makes us crazy. We are unhinged and unmoored from our foundations, adrift at sea, trying to make sense of the world, trying to have a good impact in the world, and finding it harder and harder as the world becomes more atomized, as the global economy becomes more anemic. It's much harder for modern men to find their way in life. So they have diminished agency to actually make their mark on the world, make a difference, connect with something that is truly empowering to themselves, not just something which is about earning an income, which may be just some sort of bullshit job, but actually to have meaning in their lives and to apply it in such a way that they can generate an income is much harder than it used to be. So I think that's where the modern dilemma comes in. But again, it's cumulative. The stresses and traumas that we have experienced as a species are cumulative, building from generation to generation. And even though we may be a little bit more comfortable and cozy and softer as human beings, that doesn't mean that we are not being traumatized either by the world or by our parents. And certainly our parents have an enormous impact on our emotional lives.
Right. So I know you have proposed solutions to this collective trauma, and maybe we'll come back to that a little bit later because it's sort of towards the conclusion of your book. But
sure.
Just to explore the gender dimension of this a little bit, the modern man, you've touched upon a few of the things that he's facing in life. There's the classic tasks which have not gone away of having to find meaningful work and, get an income and those sorts of things, dealing with health issues and dealing with women. But I think the difference between now and the past, and please feel free to give me your version of this, but what I took from the book was, in the past, there was a kind of recognition of the value of masculinity and the contributions of men to the world in building and creating the systems that give us life and that give us communication and that give us food and resources. And there wasn't, the full out attack on men and masculinity prior to the 20th century that there is now.
Right.
And these words like toxic and all these kinds of things.
Yes.
And the various waves of feminism have kind of increased the volume of to dumb it down to an oversimplified version, men bad, women good.
Right.
The future is female.
Yes.
Men need to step aside. Like these messages that we've all heard in the media. So this seems to be a new challenge that men are up against, is not only the traditional challenges of life, but also we're being challenged by women, and we're being challenged and asked to change. And I think in your book, you take issue with the way that feminism is trying to change men, and also the way that it's trying to change women.
Yes.
So do you want to maybe explain what you mean in this section?
Sure. So, in terms of how it's changing women, feminism does no service to womankind. Um, it if feminism's goal was to lead women back to a glorious state of empowerment, then it's wholly failed. Um, so, historically, feminism challenged women to enter traditionally male aspects of life. Certainly in the workplace, equality in the workplace, equality in the home. But what they demanded was equality of masculinity, not equality of femininity with masculinity. So what that means is that women were encouraged to embody their masculine essence, which is a very small part of their organism. Most women have a dominant female essence. Most men have a dominant masculine essence, obviously. But we all contain aspects of the opposite sex within us. But feminism kind of demanded that women shelve their femininity in order to be masculine. And the result is that women have very, very strongly integrated masculine approaches to their lives, which Carl Jung described as the animus-possessed female. So they function more from their male psychology. So there's that aspect of it as well. So as women become more masculinized, men are also becoming more, you could say, more feminized. They're certainly becoming more they're softer, more soft-spoken, less aggressive, less assertive, more operating from going with the flow, rather than seeing their masculine energy as a penetrative force. So essentially that's what masculinity is. It's a penetrative force. It's a force which penetrates and molds and recasts and reshapes the world around it, for good or bad. Wounded men shape the world for bad, and integrated, healthy men shape the world for good, to be very simplistic about it. But that's what masculinity is. And so men are being attacked like a pincer movement, both from society, both from the society which demands less of a masculine man in order to operate within it, and also from feminism or gynocentrism, however you want to frame it. And the result is that men's masculine qualities are underdeveloped these days. And there's a variety of reasons for this, which I go into. One of them is lack of guidance from male elders. Many boys and young men have been raised and are being raised in single-parent households. And when I say single parent, it's mostly single mother, because she gets custody of the kids after divorce, for the most part. So the young men have no yardstick by which to measure their lives against as to what it is to be a man and enter the world as men. All they get is messaging from their mostly female teachers at school and their mostly single parent mothers at home as to what it is that those women want those men to be. And it's their agenda. It's not about the full expression of a man's true nature. It's not about the emergence of the man himself. It's about how they want him to operate within the world. So they've taken on board the notion of toxic masculinity now. They've actually accepted that label in large part, defining themselves as something which is inherently damaged. And that there's a toxic shame around being a man, which they're having to contend with, which older generations never had to. It used to be that, like the old Gillette ads, being the best a man could be. That was the old Gillette ads as compared to the new ones.
Yeah.
So men these days are still, they're very much like boys. They haven't really become a man and to stand on their own 2 feet and assert themselves in this world. And they're very much lacking in grit, and they have an aversion to masculine energy. So that's one side of the coin, the psychological side. The other side is the societal side of the coin, this pincer movement I was describing. So the world is far, far more limited for men than it used to be. Compared to the boomer generation in particular, and taken as a whole, men have decreasing ability to apply themselves and their energies and their talents to this world in a way that makes sense for them. And it's been in decline for decades, principally because we've worked ourselves out of a job. Traditional man's role was to be the architects and the builders of civilization. Well, we've done it. We have a civilization. We've built the skyscrapers. We've built the automobiles, the railroad tracks. We've invented gadgets galore. You and I are speaking over the internet. All of these things predominantly were invented by men. And we've also implemented very, very complex systems to synthesize them and integrate them so that we have a world which runs, with just-in-time delivery and all that sort of thing. Not that that's necessarily the optimized way of running our civilization, but it's what we've done. It's what traditional men have done. And this is their legacy that they've presented us with. And there's really not as much need for that traditional masculinity as there used to be. Walking out onto the skeleton of a skyscraper in order to pound rivets into the steel bars there. We don't really do that anymore. We have machines to do that for us. So the world is changing, and it's getting more and more difficult because we have increasingly a low-wage gig economy, part-time economy. So even if men wanted to start a family, even if men wanted to be a traditional breadwinner and have a traditional stay-at-home wife, they can't afford to because they're just,
right.
they're Uber drivers. So there is this crisis of confidence in masculinity as to what value they have in life and how they can apply themselves to this world and survive at the same time. Plenty of men have passions, but they don't generate an income. So what are you supposed to do with that? I mean, other than just have them as a hobby. And just a final point about that there's this sort of generational defeatism as well, which men have suffered over the last 2 or 3 generations as jobs have been offshored to China and Mexico and wherever else. What's happened is that we have a welfare dependency culture which principally affects men who used to be blue-collar workers. And those blue-collar workers who lost their jobs to China and elsewhere, the offshoring that took place, those men have suffered enormously, but nobody sees it. Nobody recognizes it. They've suffered financially, psychologically, rates of suicide and depression. They've experienced petty crime and serious crime in their communities as a result of their communities disintegrating because they were no longer held together by traditional factories and offices and so forth. So there are millions of those men at the bottom of the ladder in this world, and their suffering is invisible to everybody. And it's just criminal. Men's pain is just not seen.
I agree with you for the most part, yes. I think that there's a lot more sympathy for women's struggles and suffering and pain than there is for men's suffering and pain, and men's disenfranchisement from the world in which we live. I do think, though, I would just make a side point that there are some people who recognize that. There are politicians, and there are some economists, and there are some public speakers and activists who recognize all of the jobs that have been lost to technology or offshoring.
Yes.
And in both the UK and in the United States, there have been movements around that, although they tend to be politically incorrect, and the mainstream media does not take kindly to them.
Yes. And in fact, Bettina Arndt did an interview with one of the former prime ministers of Australia who, in fact, understood this problem of increasingly male disadvantages because of offshoring. So I recommend people to go and look that up if they're interested.
Sure. But the general problem that you identify and you describe, I agree with. It's a collective issue. It's not something that every individual man has to find his own way within this, large problem. But as a society, as a civilization, we need to come up with some solutions to engage men and feel like they have a place at the table again, where they belong, they're recognized, they're appreciated. Their very being is not put in question, but it's not something they have to justify.
Yes.
You are part of this world. You matter. You have value. We see you, and when you're struggling, we're going to give you just as much support and sympathy as we would anybody else.
Yes.
And I just want to come back to another section of your book. There were some good quotes that you had about how we got from the past to the present.
Right.
There's a lot of talk by some people, feminists in particular, that the entire history of the world, the way they simplify it is, it was one uninterrupted chapter of collective men oppressing women. Women were always the victims, men were always the ones in power.
Yes.
And it's this kind of one-dimensional worldview. But the way you described it was, it was more, so this is from your book, you say, life was a shit show for both men and women, other than for an elite few. But to the feminists, seeing only through the lens of gender power dynamics, the subtleties are lost. So their anger, resentment, and desire to punish means that the demonization of modern man is perfectly justifiable as payback. But then I'm paraphrasing, I'm not quoting word for word, but you say this had nothing to do with patriarchal oppression. It has to do with the damaged and wounded expression of men trying to survive in a hostile environment. And there was another quote from a different page where you say, traditional men and women co-created this world. Men have been the drivers of change. So too have women been the backseat drivers of change. And it may be a man's world, but men are easily controlled by women. So a man might be driving the bus, but the woman chooses whether or not to get on the bus and let the man drive.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I think that what that really comes down to is it was a co-creation. The world, both past and present, was not something that was a purely male invention that was thrust upon women and children. It was something that men and women built together in order to adapt to the difficulties of life and the requirements for survival. But what you're hinting at is that there's a lack of accountability on the female side, that they had a role in building this.
Exactly. I mean, it really speaks to the modern feminine victim mentality. I mean, are they suggesting that for the whole of human history, women have basically sat back and watched men behave I can't even say it, badly, watch men behave badly, I can't say it, and done nothing about it? I think women have spoken up for themselves fairly well over the course of human history, but because of our different ways of meeting this world, it certainly looks to modern women, but it looks to everybody that men have been the dominant drivers of civilization. But the thing is, the reason that men were accorded that role in creating civilizations is because of their unique abilities compared to women's unique abilities. They were basically more useful tools than women. People have been used by the ruling elite, the ruling classes of history, in order to build civilizations and to exploit both people and planet and control resources. So because men are more focused on things, our minds are predisposed much more to things than to people or to relationships. There's a big overlap, obviously, but that's what the male psychology is. we have systemized thinking, and we're better suited to extracting and modifying the resources that Mother Earth gives us. We do that very well as men. So this is a very useful tool in the hands of those people who would seek to apply it. And what I also in my research, I came across a very startling statistic, which is that 75% of all the human beings that have ever lived on this planet have been slaves. Now, slaves clearly don't have very long lives, and they need to be replaced very frequently. So you can imagine that there will have been a very, very large number of slaves employed by various civilizations in order to get the work done. Men are very good slaves. We have a kind of carrot and stick mentality with those traditional masculine slaves of yesteryear, in that the carrot is essentially family, women, love, community, tribe, and rewards for their work. And the stick is loss of liberty or loss of life. So you can threaten men with loss of liberty or loss of life if they don't do what you tell them to do. If you have the power over their lives and they have little power in return, they will do what they have to do in order to get shit done. That's what men do. We get shit done. So there's also the aspect of gender dynamics where men can be seen to be in the majority of authority positions, in CEOs, in Congress, and so on. In positions of high authority, what you see is mostly men. And the feminists would have would contend that this is as a result of suppressing women, females. But it's actually more to do with our respective psychologies. Men are more predisposed to of going out and entering the workplace. Essentially it's the protect and provide mentality of masculine psychology that has enabled us to succeed in business. But as I said before, the world is fucked up because it has created deeply unhappy men who interact with the world in very dysfunctional ways. And those men prefer systems of hierarchy and dominance, which is why I also poke holes at the alpha male as well, because the alpha male is also part of that dominance hierarchy. For 95% of human history, we didn't live in dominance hierarchies. We lived in hunter-gatherer societies, and human psychology is mostly shaped by those societies. And there was a fierce egalitarianism within those societies where the sense of the self, the self-identity, the self-aggrandizement was absolutely seen as selfless. The biggest component of their psychology was group mentality. It wasn't. I mean, we these times are not normal. We think of ourselves as so striving towards individualism that we fail to recognize our unity as a species, as brothers, as sisters. We've left a lot of that legacy in our past. We've given a lot of it up. So toxic men, for want of a better word, leave their mark on the world. And it's materially observable. But women also have a toxic aspect to their nature, which is less observable, but which has also shaped this world tremendously, and nobody recognizes it. So the covert form of toxic femininity is the damage they do to men's psyches and to women's psyches as well. Women are very hard on other women as well. But the verbal, the emotional abuses that leave men feeling less than whole, which is in my heart and is in many men's hearts. We've experienced women who have left us bleeding on the inside. Many men have broken hearts. Many men had mothers who simply regarded their boys as being in service to their own agenda. to the family agenda, and paid no mind to the actual true nature of that child as it unfolded. They were simply there to serve a purpose in that family's life. Those things leave no scars on the outer world, just the inner world. And you know, the maladaptive behaviors that men exhibit don't come out of a vacuum. They come out of a world inhabited not just by men, but by women as well. Women who have shaped those dysregulated, toxic men.
Well, there's a lot in there. That's very, I don't know what to say, but that's, I have a lot of thoughts on everything that you just said, but very interesting.
Yes.
On the occupational side, in the workplace, yes, you're right. I think that one of your quotes in the book is feminists only want equal representation at the upper echelons of society, not the dirty and dangerous jobs at the bottom, or the costs and sacrifices that are disproportionately borne by men. So you devote several chapters of your book to the gender gaps that favor women. For example, the sentencing gap, men get longer sentences in jail for the same crimes. And, the life expectancy gap, men live less long than women.
Yes.
And other things. But for each man at the top, there's 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 at the bottom.
Yes.
That nobody's talking about.
Yes.
And so this is why our organization, Cafe CCMF, exists, is to give those men a voice, to give them some say, and to shine light and attention on their lives and their concerns. I've sometimes wondered, and tell me if you disagree or agree, I think what feminists really want, although they won't say it, is special equality. They don't want true equality, because true equality would mean they achieve the same results as men, but they pay the same prices and sacrifice and costs. So yes. We would have to have more women dying in the workplace. We'd have to have more women dying in war. We'd have to have more women, living on the street, committing suicide. Like, these are all things that affect men disproportionately. Drug overdoses, alcoholism, on and on. Like, there's so many. And there are, of course, issues that affect women worse than men. But those are the only ones that seem to get attention. And the areas where men are falling behind, such as education, or the other ones I mentioned, feminists don't want to deal with any of that. They want the indoor, air-conditioned, cushy jobs at a marketing company or a tech company or something. They don't want to be in the sewers. They don't want to be on an oil rig. Well, I shouldn't generalize here. Some women do. And some women are currently in those jobs, and they like it, and they want to do that. That's fine. But on average, statistically, they tend to not choose those jobs as frequently as men. And that's one of the reasons for the wage gap that is often brought up, and which you yet again challenge and debunk in your book, as many others have previously.
Yes. So
to me, special equality is they want the privileges of being women with the benefits of being men, but the responsibilities of neither.
Right.
And that's maybe a very harsh way of describing it. I'll probably take some flack for this, but to me, that's what it looks like.
And to me too. Yes, I should say yes. Me too. That's how it looks. Yes, I make a sort of I pose a particular train of thought in my book about what it would be like if the next president were to announce to the United States. I live in the United States. Were to announce to the United States that if it was Kamala Harris, for instance, that she was going to implement across the board social programs to increase female participation 50-50 across the board, across all different careers and jobs, so that as many women in one sector were being employed as many men in another sector. So that would mean that you would have to equalize, let me see if I remember, more female telecommunications line repairers and installers. You would have to equalize female refuse collectors, female park attendants, female septic system technicians, female crab fishermen, female oil riggers, for instance, female pest control workers. And you don't hear that request coming from feminists. They don't want those shitty jobs. Only men who are principally focused, to their detriment, I would say, on generating a high income will do jobs which are shitty but which pay well.
Yes, and there's a few other, sorry for interrupting, but there's a few other dimensions of this. Some of the jobs that are not dirty and dangerous, they still are shitty in a different way. Like the CEO of a big company that makes the 7-figure salary, right at the top of the income distribution. He is spending so much time at work that he's probably never seeing his family. He's never seeing his friends. He has no time for hobbies and leisure activities. Like it's all work all the time. Yes. And that is Warren Farrell said, the path towards higher income and higher wages, it's a toll road. You pay the price to get there.
Yes.
And some women are also paying that price, and they've made the choice, and they say, yes, I want that. I want to work 80 hours a week. I want to make 6 or 7 figures and have the C-suite corner office, and that's fine. And I think you and I would agree that they should be allowed those choices, but they should also recognize that, you have to pay the same costs as men are paying to get into that position.
Yeah. For years, women have been clamoring to enter traditionally male workplaces and workspaces. They are less happy than they were in the 1950s. So that kind of makes you scratch your head. If they're actually leading the sort of lives which they have been demanding that they want to lead, why are they now less happy? And so there's a subchapter I talk about the subversion of the feminine essence, and about how, essentially feminism has pushed women into avenues of life which do not serve their unfolding. There are women who should, as you say, be the CEOs, who should have that sort of life. But really, it's women who have a very dominant masculine essence by default. There are women out there like that. And they don't want a family. They don't want an intimate relationship which takes precedence over their career. But that's the standard, that's the default that is presented to modern women, that should be their default position. So, what can I say?
Yeah, and I heard a quote recently. I can't remember if it was, I think it was the factual feminist. What's her name? From the United States.
Yes. Christina Hoff Sommers.
Yes, Christina Hoff Sommers. I think she said that feminists always say no means no when it comes to sexual consent.
Yes.
But when women say no to feminism, they don't take no for an answer.
Oh,
and
very
I
good.
find that
very good.
quite.
Yes.
I found that quite comedic because, of course, you and I and nearly all modern men would agree, women should have the freedom to choose whatever life they want.
Right.
And they should accept the consequences and sacrifices of whichever life path that is, whether that's a stay-at-home mother, whether it's somebody who's working part-time in the home, outside of the home, or whether it's someone who's working full-time outside of the home. They should have that choice, but they should also recognize that you can't have everything you want all the time in life, and there are trade-offs. There are costs and benefits to every path.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Yeah, there's an opportunity cost for every choice that we make.
Exactly. And the men have never had it all. They talk about why can't women have it all? Men haven't had it all either. It's because the ones who make it to the top have paid a tremendous personal price to get there most of the time.
Yes.
They're not seeing their families. They're not doing other things that they like to do. They may be sacrificing their health. And a lot of men don't want to make those sacrifices as well. So they're happy with a more modest career a modest income and so forth. But just on the jobs point, to come back to this, in addition to women not asking to be sewer workers and oil rig workers and these sorts of things, they're not asking for more male elementary school teachers. They're not asking for more male nurses. I'm sure some are in some corner, but I haven't seen any large-scale campaigns on LinkedIn or social media calling for more men in traditionally female-dominated fields. So if it's really about equality, you have to ask, why is that?
Quite so. Yeah, and I'm going off a little bit of a tangent here, but many women who have entered high power careers, for instance, are finding it a lot harder to attract or be attracted to men who would be good intimate partners with her. So, for instance, men who wanted to be the stay-at-home dad are actually less desirable as mates than other men. So, the criticism from modern women is that men basically focus on the packaging, what a woman looks like, how she giggles and wiggles. And they claim that they really want men to be attracted to women of any age, any shape, however good they keep themselves. Yet, the opposite is not true. Those high status women who are occupying the alpha women that Susan Venker talks about, those alpha women are finding it harder and harder to find partnerships because what's mostly available to them are that women basically trade up when they look for partnerships. So what's mostly available are lower status men than she. And in the book, I make mention that you don't hear of male janitors demanding that female doctors find them sexy because they're more than just their job. Female doctors just don't give janitors a second glance. But of course, female doctors, if they want to trade up, if they want to access the sort of social networking and prestige from a higher caliber man, find fewer and fewer men at those higher echelons to as part of the mating pool, if you like.
Yes, and I think what you're getting to is hypergamy, which is the female tendency to date across and up that some others have talked about on Jordan Peterson and others online. As women rise, their dating pool gets smaller, and that's one of the unfortunate side effects of women succeeding in the workplace is that the matching at the pairing up at approximately equal socioeconomic levels is kind of breaking down because women are in many cases displacing men in the workplace and overtaking them, and yet they're still looking up. And a lot of men, as you pointed out in the beginning of this talk, they've been disenfranchised, they've lost their jobs to technology and overseas workers. So they're kind of falling down in a relative sense. And so people are finding it harder and harder to find suitable matches.
I think Warren Farrell once said that women don't desire men they don't admire. And that's such a nice little nutshell in which to encapsulate gynocentrism. Women don't want to mate with low status men, the unemployed, the basement living, rudderless, pizza eating, porn watching men. They don't have fantasies about those men. They have fantasies about, the sort of the 50 Shades of Grey billionaire type of man, the Richard Branson or the Elon Musk or, some high quality male, which they will never meet. They will never meet, but they will have fantasies about them. Mm-hmm. They're attracted to men. This is coming back to hypergamy, I guess, but perhaps is also a key component of female psychology. But they're attracted to men who are risk takers, who are brave, who are self-reliant, who are stoic. They like men who are intelligent, but they value intelligent men because those intelligent men can access resources which other men might not be able to. Mm-hmm. And the women can make use of that man. So they like intelligent men for that reason. But, a lot of men will recognize that women also like men who have a good sense of humor, who have certain communication skills like oratory abilities, and so on. And of course, they like confident men as well.
Yes. So I just wanted to ask you to slightly shift the topic. Is you mentioned to me that in the past, when you were younger, you used to be more sympathetic towards feminism, and there was a kind of a turning point when you discovered the work of speakers such as Karen Strawn and Janice Fiamengo, and it was really those the female speakers rather than the male speakers who are critiquing feminism. That was the key, eureka moment for you, where you woke up and saw the world for what it was. Do you want to maybe tell me about how that happened and then how you integrated that afterwards?
Yeah, it's the same story. Essentially, we are blind to men's suffering. And so when men would speak about their suffering, I didn't hear them. It was only when I heard women talking about men's suffering that my ears pricked up. And, that I'm entirely grateful to Karen Strawn, who was the first person I listened to go after feminism. But, I'm not, I consider myself now an anti-feminist, but I'm certainly not anti-woman. And I place an emphasis on men and women treating each other with respect and kindness and consideration. And certainly the latter chapters in the book point to how to produce a culture which creates well-adjusted men and women who love each other, and how we might go about manifesting that. I was a feminist for 30 years. 30 years I was a feminist. I believed the feminist narrative that women had a degree of oppression, and that once those issues had been addressed, a fairer and a kinder world would be there for both men and women. So I'm not anti-woman at all, and I still believe in women's issues. I still favor women solving their problems and men helping them solve their problems. But there came a time when I felt conned by feminism, and my eyes were opened, and I view feminism harshly now. But this book is for the conscious man, and bringing it back to the beginning again, for a conscious man, what is he needs to see things as they really are. And the feminist movement on a day-to-day basis is probably the single most adverse thing in his life, which has real-world implications that he needs to understand. So I devote a whole chapter in the book to it. And I focus on feminism for the simple reason that, yes, most of the issues facing men these days stem from feminist ideology.
Yes, and I think that's a very important and very specific way that you describe the problem. And we have to be clear that being anti-feminist is not anti-woman. Correct. And it's not, it doesn't mean that you are against the well-being and the flourishing of women on this planet. It just means that this one particular ideology, which has a historical development, has not been on the net balance helpful for men and women, and we need to change direction.
Yes. Yeah, I want equality between men and women, but there's a nuanced understanding of that sort of equality. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know what the future looks like, but it certainly won't look like what we have now, which is demonized men and animus-possessed women. And I don't think it'll look like the traditional roles of men and women of the 1950s. But there are men and women are different from each other, and that's becoming less and less politically correct to make mention of. So even though I'm in favor of equality between the sexes, I'm also in favor of discrimination between men and women. And it's funny to say that, because when you say the term discrimination, there's automatically an implication that it judges negatively on one party as opposed to the other. But discrimination simply means observing a difference between two things and taking action upon those differences. So, it's like the difference between, I can discriminate between taking an aeroplane and taking a bus, but nobody's going to cry oppression if I choose the aeroplane over the bus. So that's all discrimination is. So I actually want to discriminate between men and women and see them for who they really are, and actually acknowledge our sex differences. So, the sort of society that we want to aim to in the future, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if it's going to be more egalitarian with a symmetry of influence. And I don't know if it's going to be where men, for instance, lead other leaders in society, because that's part of our masculine essence. Men generally lead, and women generally follow. That's their essence. They surrender. They flow with change. That's part of their feminine essence. So if you look around today and you see the leaders that we have right now, I'm sure a lot of people will be shaking their heads and say, no way, no way. That sounds like a recipe for disaster. But like I said before, the leaders and the sort of world we inhabit right now are the products of a dysfunctional and dysregulated history. But that doesn't mean that men should not lead and that women should not follow. Because if the man is taking the best interests of the woman at heart and not negating her experience and making sure that any decisions he makes as a leader are fall into alignment with her own true nature, then there's no problem in leadership, in men being a leader. He just needs to be attuned to the woman, either at the personal or interpersonal level, or at a societal level. I give a couple of analogies in the book about partner dancing. In partner dancing, a man leads a woman around the dance floor, and she likes it. She actually likes being led by a man when dancing. He controls her movements. She doesn't have a choice in it. He lifts up her arm for her to spin under. He pushes her away, pulls her back, sways her from one side to the other, does all sorts of things, and she loves it. So that seems to me a very strong indication that women like to be led and to be, and this is a bad word, but I'll say it, like they like to be manipulated by men, but for their own best interest, their own enjoyment, their own self-edification. So that's really, I leave that question hanging, because I think that it is part of men's character and essence, our masculine essence, to lead women and for women to enjoy the experience. But we need to be skillful in doing so.
Mm-hmm. So just to clarify, because I'm sure we'll get some questions, when you say be manipulated by men, are you talking about being being led is one way to interpret it, but is there another interpretation that?
Yes, I clearly don't mean it in the negative sense. Mm-hmm. Certainly not. Absolutely not. Mm-hmm. I mean it in the form of, let's take lovemaking, for instance. I'm not going to get too specific, but a woman basically wants to be led by a man between the sheets. He takes the most active role. He decides which positions to put her in, when to lie face to face and stare lovingly into her eyes. He, pulls her towards him at the edge of the bed, etc., etc. If she has to ask him to do that, then she is actually stepping into her masculine essence, and there is a loss of attraction for the man, and in that moment, because he is not exercising his role as a leader in love.
Yes, and it's similar with dancing. It's similar with other activities. I think what you're getting at is the kind of harmony between male energy and female energy, and it's the yin-yang balance.
Yes.
Which is the beautiful image of Taoism.
Yes.
That it's not that one is better than the other. It's not that one controls the other necessarily. It's more just that they have a complementary relationship, and when they're both performing their roles properly, the two work in harmony.
Exactly.
And they work for each other, not against each other. And I think that one of the clear themes throughout your book is that where we are now, the status quo, is kind of dysfunctional because the two genders are working against each other.
Yes.
And they're wasting a lot of energy and time fighting over things when they should be figuring out how to make the best use of our strengths, male and female strengths, and gender neutral strengths to build a better world.
Yeah. My hope is that men and women can take a path forward where we, both of us collectively, own our own shit, own our shadow aspects. I do a lot. I write a lot about shadow aspects in the book as well. Mm-hmm. And actually celebrate what the opposite sex brings to our lives so that we bring out the best in each other. And I write about high-level relationships in terms of the divine union, the divine masculine, the divine feminine, mm-hmm. and how we can inhabit those divine aspects of our nature and meet each other in those divine aspects. Mm-hmm. So, there are some harsh truths in this book about how men and women behave dysfunctionally with each other, but I don't leave it at that. I also offer, it's a map. I offer a trail with a trailhead to go down in order to walk towards more evolved ways of relating with women and more evolved ways that men can self-author themselves as well. Mm-hmm. Men and women are designed for each other. We've been designed for each other as a species. We've been with each other from the beginning. And despite our contemporary levels of dysfunction, we are actually supposed to be good for each other.
Yes.
So there's a challenge here, and it's a tough challenge. We live in very, very troubled times. It's very difficult to find a modern woman who is capable of the sort of intense, emotional, spiritual, intimate work in order to be in a relationship with a conscious man. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't stop looking for them. And there's an opportunity to explore with that woman the unformed and unintegrated aspects of ourselves and she with us as well. The stuff that makes our heart sing as well as our shadow aspects, and consciously work with each other to create more passionate, unified, loving human beings with each other who adore each other. And that's a path of ascension. It allows us to evolve as conscious men, as conscious women.
Yes. So as we're coming towards your conclusion here, you mentioned the divine feminine and divine masculine and the divine union. What I'm understanding is that there's kind of there's a multifold approach we need to take. So one of the quotes from the book is, what you wrote is, the solution to the world's problem is, you would suggest, twofold: a collective evolution through personal self-actualization,
right,
and a systemic restructuring of the world we inhabit.
Yes.
So this is
Thank you for pulling out that quote. That's probably my favorite quote in the book, because it sounds so weird and so simple and so mind-bogglingly difficult to achieve.
Well, it's certainly difficult, but I think it is simple, at least on the surface, to understand. The way I understand it is, we need to look inside ourselves, we need to look at each other, and then we need to look out together at the world and say, in each of those three spheres, in the the first personal, the second person, and the third personal perspective, what is broken and what needs to be fixed, and what needs to be rebalanced. Because certainly things are out of balance right now. I agree. Right. And we seem to be in a place right now where we've, in the distant past, men and women were mutually dependent on each other for survival, and now we're mutually independent, and both of them can survive on their own, although they're not at their best when they are completely independent, because to be at their best, they need each other. So it's the question of how do we move past these very transactional and unhealthy relationship styles towards healthier unions and healthy relationships where we bring harmony and complementarity back.
Yeah, that is a hell of a question. That's a hell of a dilemma.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we can only do what we can do, which is within our power. And certainly as conscious men, what is within our power is to work on ourselves and to fashion ourselves into our the highest version of ourselves. And whether or not that attracts a woman, whether or not we want a woman in our lives, I think that's an admirable path to take. As far as the feminist messaging, as far as the way that men have been stigmatized in society, all we can do is empower people to speak up about it. And it's difficult. I recognize it's difficult. Cafe is doing the sort of work that it needs to do. The people in the manosphere are doing the sort of work they need to do. But, the feminist movement is $1 billion industry. They get a lot of money. And so you're going up against big guns when you go up against feminists. But that's not to say that we shouldn't fight the good fight. It just means it's difficult. So I use this is near the quote that you just quoted, but I use the analogy of a double helix. And essentially you have two strands of the double helix. And if you consider one strand as being self-actualization, as being creating the best version of yourself, and the other strand being societal improvement, a better society produces a better individual, man or woman. A better individual produces a better society. And then a better society in turn produces a better individual. And so you flow upwards. The energy flows up this double helix as it wraps itself around itself, each strand improving the other as it moves towards the top. Now, that is basically what we need to do as a human species. We need to improve ourselves and at the same time improve the material conditions in which we find ourselves so that we can access powers which we had hitherto not been able to access on our own. So, simple. It's very simple, but very difficult.
Yeah, one thing that I've just noticed in my personal life when I look around at people in the world is there's a huge amount of untapped potential in people's lives.
Yes.
Because they end up in jobs that they're not particularly passionate about. They end up in situations where they're just struggling to pay the bills, or they spend a lot of their leisure time watching television or distracting themselves through some other means. And we're living very unconsciously, I would say, most people nowadays. So moving even some degree towards a more conscious life where you slow down and you really examine yourself and the people around you and the world around you. The way you've described it, I think, is a very beautiful vision. I think it's difficult. It's certainly a challenge. It's not something that can be done overnight.
Right.
But unless we start to move and take steps in that direction, I don't know what the future will look like. If we continue to slide into polarization with identity politics and this group versus that group, and the tribalism that seems to be taking over now, and the entry of politics into every aspect of life. Some people like Dave Rubin have pointed out that everything is politics now. Whether it's sports, television, film, comic books, food, transportation, traveling, everything is politics. And it's like, are you on this side or that side? And if you're on the other side, you're an evil person. I don't want to talk to you. You have to be on my side, and both, I would say, a lot of people, it doesn't matter who you vote for, they're guilty of this polarization, and that's clearly not helping our world.
Right. Yeah, politics is the new religion. It's replaced religion as the fundamental cornerstone of our existence, and it's not good. It's not good. Politics doesn't have to be bad. It doesn't have to be polarizing, but at the very beginning of the book, I talk about the importance of nuanced thinking and how we need to get back to seeing grains of truth in other people's arguments, even if it's not in accordance with our own beliefs. So yeah, you were saying that so again, it's my mind is going in two directions here. We need this kind of slow, gradual improvement of society, but I don't think we have that much time left. So we also need swift action. And at the end of the book, I basically pose the question of when is enough going to be enough? When is the suffering that we have experienced as a species? When are we going to stand up and say, okay, I'm not taking it anymore? And essentially, the question I pose is about whether we comply with our rulers or not, whether we follow their dictates, and how to stand up and be a man who has a code of honor, who has a purpose in his life, and about what that means in terms of how he penetrates the world with sacred masculine intent. Now, I would say we need to use our masculine essence to penetrate the world in a beneficial way, to use our systematizing brains to make this world better more quickly than the slower progress that I've been suggesting. We actually need to stand up and say, I'm not going to take it anymore. I'm not going to comply. Because what is at stake is our own consciousness. There is a war on our consciousness being undertaken right now. And, the world has been shaped and governed by the ruling elite, and behind us lies this ocean of misery, which I think the writer who wrote the article in the Washington Post, Why Can't We Hate Men, alluded to, that we have faced this millennia of woe. And she put it at the feet of men. But she's true. We have faced a millennia of woe. What she fails to recognize is that men have also experienced a millennia of woe as well. So men and women are living in a world not fit for human consumption, and we have to grapple with that problem in the here and now. And we can't simply allow incremental change to get us to the sort of new world that we envisage. We actually have to take radical steps in implementing the sort of world we want to inhabit. So conscious men would do well to work towards creating the fundamental conditions where we place more value on not what the market produces or rewards. So in sort of the rewarding us money for the goods and services that we produce, but where we instead realize the sort of society which could provide an optimized humanity, a fully realized people, where we place more value on the intangibles like wisdom and authenticity and courage and compassion. We don't get paid for developing those qualities within us. Society does not reward us with money for developing those qualities, which is very curious to think about, because we very much value them, but we're not rewarded for bringing them into our organism. What if we were? What if we were paid in some sense, maybe not a monetary sense, but what if we were rewarded by society for becoming the best versions of ourselves?
Well, that's an interesting philosophical question, and I don't have an answer for it, but it's good to at least, we can keep that in our mind and maybe contemplate it. There's a lot of big questions that your book poses, and I certainly don't want to try and answer. It would be impossible to have a quick answer to any of them, really. But I would say that I encourage people to read the book because it's a fascinating, thought-provoking work that really makes us question a lot of things, not just about men and women, masculinity, femininity, but it goes far beyond that to, as we've been talking about for the last hour and a half, all of these broader contextual questions, economics, politics, resources, the environment. And I think there will certainly be some disagreement. There'll be some diverging viewpoints on, the ruling elite and how they've made us all slaves. So hopefully we can get people leaving some comments in this video on what they think about that aspect of the book, whether they have something to say, they liked it, they disliked it. But certainly I think in terms of painting a picture of what men are up against in the current year and what they need to deal with as they go through their life, I think this book has been an excellent example of that. And I really appreciated that you sent me a copy to read.
Thank you, Warren. I wonder if I might just finish by sharing a quote for your listeners as well, which is my personal mantra. So it goes like this. I say to myself, this is where I am. This is the wounding I carry, having lived this life on this earth, with these people, with this body, under these circumstances, and with these evolving values and beliefs. This is how all of it affects me in moments as they unfold. And knowing all of this, I love and accept myself as perfectly imperfect, committing myself to stepping towards my higher self, however I might stumble.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Warren.
This has been a pleasure. So I hope we'll have a chance to speak again in the future.
Thank you. I'd really like that.
Just as a final note, we will put your website and a link to your Amazon book page in the description. It's michaelronin.net where people can reach you. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Great. Well, I hope people will go check it out, read the book, leave comments, send you some feedback, and who knows, maybe someday there'll be a book 2 where you have some answers to the big questions that you've answered.
Yeah, my next book is going to be on Game B civilization, if people are familiar with that concept.
Okay, I'm not familiar with it, but do you want to tell us a quick 30-second version?
Yeah, the 30-second version is that what we have right now is Game A civilization, the civilization we know, and Game B civilization is what the optimized form of civilization might look like without being, a prototypical utopian fantasy.
Very interesting. Well, I look forward to that one too. Thank you, Michael. Well, we'll leave it at that. So have a good night and we'll talk soon.
Thank you, Warren. It's been a real pleasure.